Welcome to Rogue Studios, and welcome to parties. And parties can be celebrations, it can also be political parties and associations. And the word party, the singular, can also be an individual, someone involved in a lawsuit or just a character from the village, you know. The thing about this exhibition is the core of the show isn't really the subject matter of the paintings. It's an attempt to use painting to represent history. I think of myself as a history painter, and if you're going to claim that you're a historian in any medium, there's two things you need to have in place. You need to have some sort of working conception of history, some sort of idea or concept of history, and also some primary source material, some original documents to work from. So what I've done over the past 10 to 15 years is I've toured around Europe, everywhere from Lisbon to Berlin to Vienna to Paris, looking for these tiny printed amateur snapshots. And if anyone's kind of a bit puzzled as to what that is, I'll just hold one up for you. You might be able to tell that the painting behind us here is based on this printed snapshot, which was taken in 1939 in Ashdown Forest. The reason I chose this image to paint is because it's August 1939, and we all know what happened on September the 1st, 1939. The Germans invaded Poland. So this is a glimpse of the old English social order facing an uncertain future. And they're looking into the sun, they're squinting, and they're clearly, metaphorically, not aware of what's about to happen to them. So all the paintings in the show are painted from similar sorts of snapshots collected from all over. And the concept of history that I'm working to was pioneered by a German historian called Leopold Rank, a mid-19th century German historian who claimed that history was essentially the story of how things happened. How did things happen? How did they come about? And he really urged historians to go to primary source material, to forget overarching grand narratives of history, big stories about historical development, and look for evidence, documents, photographs, accounts of events, and to study them in depth. And he was responsible for professionalizing history, the study of history. So I've got primary source material in the form of snapshots and letters and documents, all mixed together in the show. And the concept of history that I'm using is, broadly speaking, the past. Anything that's in the past is history. All our shared collective experience of prior times is historical. But obviously there are some world-shattering events that form the context for our everyday lives. So some of these images show people celebrating weddings or just going out for a drink, but in the background there will be bigger events, bigger developments. And the clues are in the dates that are on many of the paintings. So if we look over there at that wedding group, for example, that painting is called Hochzeit 1932, and it's literally a matter of months before Hitler takes power as Chancellor of Germany in January 1933. So those four youngsters in the front of that painting are likely to have been drafted in 1939 into the Wehrmacht and sent to fight Germany's war. The show divides roughly into two sections. This is, believe it or not, the celebrations end of the show. At the far end is the conflict, the political conflict end of the show. And it's divided in the middle, this exhibition, by an ideological corridor, which is lined with propaganda magazines. So we're starting up this end because it's a little bit lighter for everybody. And what I've tried to do is set up dialogues between the paintings on the wall. So you have to sort of look at the paintings, check the dates on the titles, and relate them to each other. I want to get away from this idea of painting as a commodity. You know, I don't want to do a show of individual pictures for sale that have no relation to each other. I'm interested in how paintings can interact with each other to create a kind of spatialized impression of history. You know, if history is temporal and spatial and social, then the dates on the images and the way they're arranged in the space and the fact that lots of people appear to be in the room with us in these paintings is as close as I can get to sort of a simulacrum of history. So we feel we're moving amongst people who've experienced and witnessed history in these paintings. So just look at behind you on that video there. This is 2 Super 8 movies, which I've got here in a box, that I got from eBay. I just put the words parties and home movies into an eBay search, and I got these two fabulous little spools of film shot in Ashton-under-Lyne in 1961. So this is the start of the swinging 60s. It's a terraced house, two fancy dress parties, one after the other. And people are really enjoying themselves. No one's scrolling on their mobile phone. Everyone's dressed up. It gets really debauched the more you watch it. This guy's amazing. You know, everyone has a turn, you know. Everyone does something comic and funny. And this is the generation that had never had it so good. Harold Macmillan, you've never had it so good. Rationing was over. There's an economic upswing. And people were taking pride in life, you know, dressing up and enjoying themselves. Right next to them is two paintings from two photos taken in 1960 in Berlin in a little bar, and it's a works do. It's the same people in both paintings. If you move around here, and in my imagination, this guy, the big guy, is the boss. He's got the whole office out with him in the bar. He's handed a camera over to the barman, who's stood where we're standing, and the barman has taken a couple of shots. And in that one, he's alone with the woman of his dreams, I imagine. You can't dictate the meaning of a painting or a photograph. You can't tell people what to think about them. So everything I tell you is my own interpretation of what's going on. And if you're an artist, it might seem weird that I'm talking about the paintings as though they're living people. But that's because I want to use painting to direct people's attention onto lived experience, onto the people, places, and things that was in the original snapshots. So it's a kind of slightly unconventional take on painting. They're not invented, they're not exaggerated, they're not, you know, montaged or collaged from different images. They are the original proportions of the snapshots, and I've tried as carefully as possible to replicate the feel and the atmosphere in those shots. Looking across at the other side of the room, in my mind there's a dialogue going on, because this is Germany and that's Paris, a nightclub called Le Boeuf sur le Toit, which is a really famous Parisian nightclub. And this is a Danish couple enjoying life after the Second World War is over. They've got a champagne on the go and a fag. You'll see a lot of those around the room. And, you know, life has returned to some degree of normalcy, you know, and people are out and enjoying themselves again. This part of the show is kind of pre and post-war. There's pre-war naivety in evidence, and there's post-war relief and positivity. And I'm hoping that comes through in the paintings. On the floor amongst you, there are 3 empty bookcases. And each of the portraits on the bookcase is from a tiny little passport snap. They're all ethnic German citizens. This chap is an ex-Nazi party member, which you can tell because his Nazi badge has been removed from his lapel for this photograph there. There are 2 tiny holes. So he's been denazified after the Second World War. This lady was living in the western side of Czechoslovakia, and at the end of the war she was expelled across the border into what became East Germany. So she was on the run from reprisals in Czechoslovakia at the end of the Second World War with her husband. That chap was imprisoned in an internment camp in Czechoslovakia and was released about 3 years later in 1948. And I found all this out from the inscriptions on the backs of the photos and done some research. And the reason why they're attached to little bookcases, empty bookcases, is to suggest erasure and displacement and hurried exits from theatres of conflict. They would have just swept whatever was precious to them into a bag or a suitcase and scarpered or been expelled. So I'm hoping that these empty bookcases kind of evoke that feeling of dispossession. So just here, alongside the Berlin Wall, we've got 2 portraits. There's a couple here who are just enjoying a fancy dress party, much like Otto's party further down. I found 2 photographs of this couple. The second one was taken about 30 years later, and they look completely fed up with each other. Really sad and old and flaccid and bored and depressed. And in this shot, which is clearly the earlier one, they've probably just met and they're having a fabulous night. His jockey's cap is on the mantelpiece. She's dressed up as a fish in a net, so she's a good catch, you know. All the humour in there. He's had far too much to drink, obviously, and she's fairly alert and wondering what's going to happen next. So I just like that as an image of celebration, pure and simple. This chap was a GP in Germany before the war. He was an army doctor in the Wehrmacht during the war. And after the war, he returned to East Germany, to a small town, and lived under the communists, under communist rule, as a doctor to Russian occupying forces. So he survived because of his profession. You know, he was exonerated from his service in the German army and went on to cure and look after Russian soldiers stationed in the East. And in this image, it's Rosenmontag during Carnival, which still happens in Germany, I believe. And he's squirting the crowd with a large medicinal syringe thing here. But I just thought there was a little bit of something kind of quite ambiguous about that and interesting. Anyway, if you look behind those two lovely fellows over there, and simultaneously across at that young chap there, we've got two young German citizens. This chap has gone to a photography studio and had himself immortalized wearing his Nazi youth badge. He's clearly in search of meaning. You just take some time to look at his dilated pupils, his widened eyes. He's had himself photographed in heroic postures. He looks like a studious young man. But if you look across at young Kurt Demling on the other side, and that photograph was probably taken a little bit earlier on, he was a primary school teacher in Germany, in Berlin in the 20s and 30s. And as you go past the Berlin Wall here, you'll see a second portrait of him in his Wehrmacht army costume, in his uniform. He was drafted into the German army in October 1944 and went missing in action in February 45. He lasted 4 months. He was 47 by the time he was put into the army. He wasn't a Nazi party member. He was completely uninterested in anything, in any kind of militarism. And in between the two portraits, the young and the older Kurt Demling, that's his last letter to his wife from the front. And, you know, it's a poignant reminder that lots of people on both sides of every conflict are unwilling participants. And that there is actually a sort of a shared class outlook across opposing ideological lines, across national borders. People in similar positions on both sides of a conflict can't understand why things are happening and don't really want to be involved. So I think there's a lesson to be learned there. And if the show does anything, hopefully, it's sort of a lesson from history. It's looking at history in order to find out, as Rank did, why things happen, why things happening today happened from a historical perspective. So let's go round to the other end. Anyone who dares to come through the ideological corridor, it's lined with Nazi party publications on one side and communists on the other. It's meant to be claustrophobic. So on these two sides of these stands, we've got roughly contemporary takes on communism. Although these are all images of Vladimir Lenin, they were all produced under Stalin. Stalin used Lenin's image to legitimate his rule in the post-war period. So this is a Russian take on the communist political heritage here. And on this side, we've got the American take on the communist heritage, where 4 suspected Communist Party members have been put on trial for their beliefs. So this is the House Un-American Activities Commission putting trades unionists, teachers, activists on trial unofficially. This was outside the official American legal system. These were kangaroo courts set up in cities around the US. People were put under pressure and questioned. And even if they weren't in prison necessarily, because it was a citizen's court, they could still be drummed out of their jobs and professions on a permanent basis. This short film here is about that process, but from the perspective of McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy, who initiated this program of trials. So this is the House Un-American Activities Commission film about these suspected communists, and this guy here is one in case. We've all probably heard about the purge of Hollywood. during the McCarthy era, from the late 40s through to the 70s. This is Edward Dmytryk, who was a film director, made a lot of big Hollywood movies, and who named suspected communist actors, directors and producers under oath. And his testimony is on one of these text panels. So the reason that the paintings are interspersed with text panels is because the reading I was doing while making the paintings tended to feed into and inform my choices of subject matter. So I wanted to include excerpts from what I was reading while I was making the paintings. Then I came across an essay by John Berger, who I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, called The Uses of Photography. And John Berger talks about what he calls a radial system, where you arrange images, photographs or paintings, and texts spatially to convey a multi-perspectival take on historical events. Rather than telling a linear history, which you illustrate with photographs, you get this multi-perspectival, spatialized account, which is not necessarily narrative-based. So there are gaps in the story as you come down the gallery. There are contradictions, displacements, gaps, contradictory testimonies coming from the paintings and the documents. And that's because I don't want to tell a fake story about how history developed. Just behind my dear friends Heather and Emmanuel, and mounted on a wardrobe, is an image of a young girl in her prime, in her late teens, who again, like the chap in the 5-part portrait there, has joined the Nazi Party, the Hitler Youth, and is having herself photographed out for a country walk. This is 1941. The Germans were on a wave of enthusiasm and optimism about their own war effort, and there's a kind of exuberance and almost a sort of innocence, but it's right on the line, isn't it? How aware were German citizens of what was happening in the East, in Poland? They were thinking of the war as a defensive war, and that's something that's used now, today, isn't it? People go to war, countries go to war, and they claim it's a war of defense while they're annihilating and destroying adjacent countries. Just one to think about, I think. And that's her in a beer garden with her partner and their friends. They're having a fantastic afternoon, you know, loads of bottles of beer, the caps are off, it's a bright sunny day. What struck me about this, apart from the fact that they don't know they're being photographed, so they're caught unawares, so it's a lot more natural than some of these images, is that on the back of this lady in the trees behind, there's a shadow that resembles a skull. And you find that a lot in photographs, particularly wartime photographs. It's a bizarre thing. You'll have an image with scabby snow on the ground, and they'll look like eye sockets, the gaps in the snow, or the undergrowth. There will be this uncanny element to what is basically a simple snapshot. I had a visitor earlier on today who said, I love the bathers. It's great to have something positive and joyous in the exhibition, in the midst of all this dark history. And I didn't have the heart to tell him that these women are bathing in a pool that's 30 kilometers from Auschwitz. These are German state administrators sent into Poland to run the ghettos in southern Poland close to Auschwitz. And the album that they're based on, I've got it up the front, anyone can have a look if they're interested. The album is full of smiling faces, people who are on a posting to a foreign country, loving the power and prestige and the opportunity, loving the travel, loving the group spirit, the unity between themselves and their colleagues. And there's several photos of them splashing about in this pond. I've been to the town in question and I've seen these places, and they're still as they were then. All the locations in the photo album that these two images were taken from are still intact. So again, you know, what does that teach us? It shows us that, you know, a landscape is never natural. Landscapes are always contrived. These are man-made pools. These are not natural ponds. These are man-made excavated pools. And although people appear to be having, you know, fun, what they're really doing is celebrating their power over other people, their ability to subject other people, to dispossess them, to corral them, to ghettoize them, and to move them to an inevitable end. But opposite that, we flash back to Weimar Germany, 1930. And this chap here is Otto Schmeider. He was the director of the dried milk recycling company that was based in Mauerstrasse, just around the corner from SS headquarters, right through the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Now, this is Otto with his Weimar period chums at a fancy dress party in about 1930. Hitler would have been around, the Nazi party would have been active, there would have been a lot of friction between them and the Social Democrats and the Communists, a lot of street fighting. At this point where there's a photo opportunity and everyone's posing, Otto chooses to throw a Sieg Heil salute. And for me, this image, and you can have a look at it, it's only tiny, is the exact tipping point from Weimar democracy into Nazi dictatorship. Okay, so at the end of the show, we've got 4 paintings. 2 of them are of Soviet collective workers. 13 women in a dressmaking factory. Stalin is hung up behind them, the watchful eye of Uncle Joe. And there's 13 or 14 very different characters arranged in 2 formal rows for a formal photography session. And I presume it would have just been a photo that they would have taken home as a memento of working in this little dressmaking factory. But there's a really interesting contrast going on with these anti-communist demonstrations taking place in America at the same time that these photographs were being taken. So this is the mid-50s, and this is the mid-50s. And you can see the ideological divide, whether or not it's objectively documented in these images. The sense of these serried ranks of workers, all staring fixedly out, proudly holding their banners, overseen by Stalin, presenting this united front, difference between them, but in unity, in collective unity as a group, as compared to the crowd in that shot there, who are obviously, very, very agitated, virulent anti-communist protesters. You may think, well, I know which side I'm on. But what I want to do is just bring the 2 sides together into a room to see if we can't create a new community from us as viewers, the people in the paintings, and the people who took the photos. The people who took the photos are just as important as the people in the paintings. Because the decision to take a photo and to record something that's happening around you is a meaningful decision. Whether or not these people are performing themselves, any of these people in the room are performing to the camera like we all do, putting their best face forward, pulling a face, trying to look their best. It's the fact that somebody decided to record them at a time of marked ideological conflict in a world fraught with all kinds of dire goings-on that really strikes me. So in one sense, it's a room full of decisions. It's decisions people make. And there's a testimony in there. Just by sitting still and being photographed, these people are testifying, they're witnessing their own times. And the idea behind the show is to bring them back to witness our times and to see if we can learn, we as the living. Who called the living a rare species of the dead? Can anyone remember? Nietzsche, thanks for... We the living are a rare species of these people. But, I wanted to rescue them from oblivion, get them out of the boxes on the pavement in these flea markets, give them a second lease of life. And when I'm painting them, by God, they look back at me with relief. They look back at me as if to say, thanks, for giving me a second go round. And I'm hoping perhaps somebody will do that for all of us one day. So thanks, folks. Thanks for listening. That's it.